All right, guys, this week we are continuing on with our modernist unit, and we are reading two stories by two different authors. And the first author that we are going to focus on is Catherine Ann Porter and The Jilting of Granny Weatherall. So Catherine Ann Porter, unlike a lot of, well, I guess like a lot of our authors during this time, lived a very colorful life. Um, she lived to be 90, so almost to 100 years old. But she was a journalist, a novelist, a short story writer, and political activist. She was born in Indian Creek, Texas in 1890, and because when her mother died when she was two, her family moved to Austin, and she was raised by her paternal grandmother, who she bases who she says she bases her character of Granny Weatherall on. She went to a convent school in Louisiana, and she ends up leaving school at the age of 16 to get married. And she never, ironically enough, never finished her high school education, and she later goes on at the later on in life and gets a degree from the University of Maryland. But um, I think it's interesting that she didn't have much of a formal education for most of the time that she was writing all of these wonderful stories. But she was a journalist in Chicago for a while, and in 1920 she moved to Mexico and became involved in a coup attempt to overthrow the president of Mexico because of the um, and she talks a lot of her stories deal with these kind of political ideologies, not necessarily the one that we're reading, but Flowering Judas, one of her stories that was written during her time in Mexico, deals a lot with political ideology. But um, after she moves back to the United States in the late 20s, right before the Great Depression. But she her first kind of collection of short stories, Flowering Judas, was really, really highly successful. And the Wilting of Granny Weatherall was in that collection. But because of the success, she earned a Guggenheim Fellowship, which afforded her the means to travel through Europe extensively. And just kind of an aside, on a cruise in 1932, she actually met Adolf Hitler and Hermann Goring, who, along with kind of the other passengers on the cruise ship, inspired her only novel, Ship of Fools, which ended up being turned into a feature-length movie that was highly successful. And she was able to retire from kind of her academic lecture life and focus solely on her writing for the rest of her life. But anyways, she lived in Paris for a while, and she was one of those expatriate American writers that we talked about, the kind of the lost generation last week. So, anyways, moving on, she had this very colorful life, and she moves to Maryland at the I don't know exactly when she moves to Maryland, but she moves to Maryland, and that is where she dies of a cerebral hemorrhage in 1980. Like I said, at the age of 90. Like most modernist authors, Porter has, I guess because her works are still here, even though she is not. She has a particular style about her writing, and it was admired from the very early parts of her career to be innovative and masterful. And particularly with The Jilting of Granny Weatherall, she uses experimental modernist narrative techniques to create a moving and believable portrait of the mind. Remember, it's not so much focused on um, kind of action, but more of that psychological mind development. And part of that lies in her use of the technique of stream of consciousness. And this is going to be a little bit confusing for some of you as you read the story, which is why I'm bringing it up now. The stream of consciousness is a literary technique where a person's thoughts and consciousness are in a continuous flow. So she's writing like people think, if that makes sense. And to kind of solidify that concept for you, it's an unusual narrative perspective that's written in third person, but the point of view is extremely close to that of Granny Weatherall. It's told, we get to see the thoughts and inner workings of Granny's mind as she's laying on her deathbed. So her thoughts are presented in this spontaneous fashion as if readers have access to her thoughts at the moment each of them occurs. So basically what Porter is doing through this narrative technique is to give us an idea of what it's like to be an 80-year-old woman whose mind tends to wander. And by that, we as readers can experience some of the same confusion that Granny feels. So, stream of consciousness, and just one more time, it's this uninterrupted flow of a character's thoughts, impressions, or feelings without the conventional devices of dialogue and description. So, this spontaneous fashion is sometimes confusing, but that's kind of the point, because Granny at this particular moment is kind of confused as to what is going on. So another modernist technique that Katherine Anne Porter uses is the use of the epiphany. And an epiphany is a modernist kind of technique where a character has a sudden insight or realization that changes his or her understanding of themselves or their comprehension of the world. So it's that kind of aha moment that a character reaches, and kind of the climax of the story. But we'll talk about that when we come together about what Granny's epiphany is. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to pick up with a little bit on the actual story, The Jilting of Granny Weatherall.